The Baxter family thought they'd struck gold when they found the house. A spacious Victorian nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by whispering trees and the soothing hum of cicadas. It was old, yes, but charming, and it seemed the perfect place to start over. Laura and Daniel hoped it would give their daughter, Sophie, a fresh start. At only 6 years old, she'd been through a lot for someone so small. From the moment they moved in, Sophie seemed happier. She'd dart around the empty halls, her giggles echoing off the walls, making the place feel alive. But after a week, her behavior changed. She'd started to talk to someone. At first, Laura and Daniel thought it was harmless. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" Laura asked one afternoon, as Sophie sat in the corner of her room, her Barbie doll clasped tightly in her small hands. "My friend," Sophie said simply, not looking up. "Your friend? What's their name?" Laura tried to sound playful. Sophie hesitated. "She doesn't have a name. I call her the Shadow Child." The word sent a shiver down Laura's spine, but she forced a smile. "Well, that's creative." By the third week, things grew unsettling. Sophie began waking up with bruises on her arms and legs, small, circular marks, like fingerprints. "What happened here?" Daniel asked one morning, pointing at a fresh purple mark on her wrist. Sophie shrugged, her tone casual. "We were playing." "Playing? With who?" Laura pressed, her voice edged with worry. "The Shadow Child," Sophie replied, her wide, innocent eyes peeking out from under a mop of blonde curls. "She doesn't like to lose." That night, Laura and Daniel lay in bed, whispering about Sophie's friend. "It's just her imagination," Daniel assured. "Kids make things up all the time." Laura nodded, but felt far from convinced. Something about Sophie's demeanor when she spoke of the Shadow Child made her stomach churn. It wasn't playful or silly, it was serious and dark. They decided to set up a camera in Sophie's room. "Just to put our minds at ease," Daniel said, though Laura noticed the tremor in his voice. The camera was discreet, tucked high on a bookshelf, aimed at Sophie's bed. They told themselves it was paranoia, that they'd laugh at the footage the next morning. That night, Laura could barely sleep. The house creaked and groaned as if unsettled by their choice. Every sound made her flinch. When morning came, they sat together at the kitchen table with Daniel's laptop. Sophie was still asleep upstairs. The footage began innocuously enough. Sophie lay curled under her blanket, her breathing steady. Hours passed, and the room remained still. But then, just after 3 a.m., the atmosphere shifted. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen unnaturally, pooling in the corners like ink. Sophie stirred in her sleep, her blanket slipping off her shoulder. And then, they saw it. Something moved. A shape, thin, angular, and impossibly black, emerged from the darkest corner of the room. Its form flickered like static, never holding its shape for long. It crept toward Sophie's bed, its elongated limbs jerking unnaturally, as if it were unused to movement. Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The thing leaned over Sophie, its featureless face inches from hers. Sophie stirred but didn't wake. The creature's long fingers, sharp and spindly, reached out, brushing her arm. That's when Sophie began to whimper, her body twitching as if struggling against something unseen. The shadow flinched, recoiling slightly, before lunging forward. It held her down, pinning her small body to the mattress. Sophie writhed, her eyes still closed, her mouth forming silent cries. When it finally let go, Sophie lay still, her tiny chest rising and falling rapidly. The shadow retreated, melting back into the corner as though it had never been there. Laura slammed the laptop shut. "What the hell was that?" Daniel looked pale, his hands trembling. I don't know." They decided not to wake Sophie. Instead, they spent the day researching, frantically trying to understand what they'd seen. Every explanation they found only deepened their dread. Shadow people, sleep demons, ghostly manifestations. None of it felt real, but after what they'd witnessed, denial was no longer an option. That night, they decided to stay in Sophie's room. They armed themselves with flashlights, salt, and prayers they hadn't spoken in years. Sophie seemed confused, but didn't protest. "It's okay. Mommy and Daddy just want to have a sleepover," Laura explained, forcing a smile. As the clock struck midnight, the room's temperature dropped. The shadows began to shift again, and this time, Sophie sat up, her eyes wide but vacant. "She's here," Sophie whispered, her voice eerily calm. The entity emerged again, this time more solid, more menacing. It stood at the foot of the bed, towering over them, its head tilting as if studying its prey. Daniel shone his flashlight at it, but the beam seemed to dissolve into the creature, swallowed by its darkness. Laura grabbed Sophie, pulling her close. "Leave her alone!" she screamed. The shadow lunged, its form stretching unnaturally. Daniel threw the salt, and for a moment, the creature recoiled, its outline flickering like a dying flame. But it wasn't enough. The room erupted into chaos, furniture shaking, the walls groaning under some unseen pressure. Sophie began to scream, her small body thrashing in Laura's arms. The shadow wrapped around them, suffocating and cold, a living nightmare. And then, Sophie spoke. Her voice was layered, as if something else spoke through her. "She's mine." When the morning came, the room was eerily calm. Sophie lay asleep in Laura's arms, her face serene, as if nothing had happened. But Laura and Daniel knew better. They packed their things that day, leaving behind everything they couldn't carry. They never returned to the house, and they never spoke of the shadow child again. But sometimes, late at night, Laura would wake with a start, convinced she'd heard Sophie whispering in her sleep. "She's still here." After the Baxters left the house, they thought the nightmare was over. They moved into a modern apartment complex, all glass windows and bright lights, hoping the sterile environment would provide safety. Sophie seemed to bounce back quickly. She laughed again, played with her dolls, and even made new friends at school. For a brief, shining moment, it felt like they'd escaped the darkness, but Laura couldn't shake the unease. One night, a week after they'd moved, Laura was doing laundry in their small utility room when she felt it, a cold draft that made the hair on her arms stand on end. The apartment had no open windows, and the air conditioning was off. Still, she brushed it off, telling herself she was imagining things. Then she heard it, a faint giggle. It was coming from Sophie's room. Laura froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She called out, "Sophie?" No response. She hurried to Sophie's room, throwing the door open. Her daughter was fast asleep, her chest rising and falling steadily. Laura scanned the room, her eyes darting to the corners, the shadows. For a moment she saw nothing, and relief began to wash over her. But then, in the farthest corner, just behind Sophie's toy chest, the shadows deepened. They pulsed, as if alive. "Sophie," Laura whispered, shaking her daughter gently. "Wake up." Sophie stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at her mother, confused. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Before Laura could answer, Sophie's gaze shifted past her to the corner. Her face lit up, not with fear, but with recognition. "She found me," Sophie said, her voice filled with a mix of wonder and dread. Laura spun around, and this time she saw it clearly. The shadow child stood there, more defined than ever, its form flickering like a dying light bulb. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a swirling void, endlessly hungry. "No," Laura said, her voice breaking. "Leave her alone." The entity stepped forward, its spindly limbs bending unnaturally. Sophie's expression shifted, her face going slack, her body rigid. It was as if she were being pulled toward the shadow by some invisible force. "Run!" Laura screamed, scooping Sophie into her arms. Daniel burst into the room, his face pale as he took in the sight. Without hesitation, he grabbed the heavy cross they'd hung over Sophie's bed, a relic from Laura's childhood. He held it out, his hands shaking. "Get out!" Daniel bellowed, his voice firm despite his terror. The shadow hesitated, its form rippling like disturbed water. It released Sophie, who collapsed into Laura's arms, sobbing. The cross seemed to work, forcing the entity to retreat. For now. The next morning, they sought help, not from a priest or a psychic, but from an obscure paranormal investigator they'd found online. His name was Marcus, a weathered man with piercing eyes and a quiet demeanor. "This isn't just a haunting," Marcus said after listening to their story. "It's an attachment. The entity isn't tied to the house, it's tied to Sophie." "What does it want?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. Marcus hesitated. "To take her. To consume her." The Baxters felt their world shatter at those words. But Marcus had a plan, though it was dangerous. They would need to sever the connection between Sophie and the entity by performing a ritual designed to close the door it had used to attach itself. "Be warned," Marcus said. "If this goes wrong, the shadow child will grow stronger. You need to stay calm, no matter what you see." That night, they prepared the apartment. Salt lined the doorways and windows, candles flickered in a protective circle, and Sophie sat in the center, clutching her favorite doll. Marcus began chanting in a language none of them understood, his voice steady and commanding. At first, nothing happened. Then the shadows began to move. They seeped from the walls, the corners, and even under Sophie's bed. The shadow child emerged, larger than ever, its form towering over them. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the candles flickered wildly. "Sophie, don't look at it," Laura cried, but her daughter's gaze was fixed on the entity. "It's mad," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow child lunged, its limbs stretching toward Sophie. Marcus shouted an incantation, and the salt around the circle flared brightly, creating a barrier that the entity couldn't cross. But it didn't give up. It slammed against the barrier, its inky form writhing, screeching in rage. The sound was unbearable, a mix of nails on a chalkboard and a child's wail. "Keep going," Daniel shouted, his hands over his ears. Marcus's voice grew louder, commanding. The shadow child began to falter, its form flickering more violently. Sophie screamed as a dark tendril reached for her, but this time, Laura grabbed her, holding her tightly. "You can't have her." With a final deafening shriek, the shadow child shattered into 1,000 wisps of darkness, which dissolved into nothingness. The room fell silent, the air suddenly light and breathable. Marcus slumped to the floor, exhausted. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse. Sophie slept soundly that night for the first time in weeks. The shadows in her room were just that, shadows. And while the Baxters would never forget what they had faced, they finally felt safe. Still, Laura couldn't help but leave a nightlight on in Sophie's room, just in case. But sometimes, late at night, she would find herself staring into the darkest corners, holding her breath, waiting for something to move.